All right, welcome back to Liquid Lunch. I am Rich Valdez, and as promised, we're going to get to the terrorist therapist. Dr. Carole Lieberman is a medical doctor, master of public health. She's board certified psychiatrist, and she's had a lot of extensive experience in dealing with this since 9/11. She's helped children to cope and to deal with understanding what terrorism is and dealing with all of that comes with the post-traumatic stress of going through a terroristic ordeal like America did 19 years ago today. So Liquid Lunch, help me welcome Dr. Carole Lieberman.
Hello.
Hi, Dr. Carole. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So I'm thinking of, as a parent, as a dad, so many people are going to have questions on how do we explain to our kids who maybe didn't live through the attacks of September 11th, but to help them understand what terrorism looked like in 2001 and how do they, what's the best way for a parent to broach that topic?
Well, first of all, one has to particularly look for opportunities like today when children are likely to see something in the media about terrorism, about 9/11, and have questions, but you shouldn't really wait until they ask you questions. You should be talking to them. You know, the only time people think about terrorism these days, because the media is so filled with coronavirus, is when we go to the airport, and people aren't doing much of that these days either, you know, but when you have to take your shoes off, all of a sudden you remember, oh yes, there are terrorists. Parents need to explain to kid. I talk about telling kids that terrorists are like bullies on the playground. You know, according to the age of the child and the psychological maturity, you sort of tailor your talk in that way. But you can start with explaining that it's like the bullies on the playground. Every child understands that. Mm-hmm. I wrote a book just to help parents with this very issue, because even those parents who realize that they should talk are afraid they're going to say something wrong, or they don't want to scare their kids. So I wrote my book called Lions and Tigers and Terrorists, Oh My, How to Protect Your Child in a Time of Terror. And the first half of the book is for parents and teachers, grown-ups, and how to talk to kids, how to answer their questions, how to build resilience in kids. And then the second half is a picture book and an activity book for kids where, you know, I talk about Osama bin Laden and 9/11. It's not just about 9/11. I talk about terrorism in general and ask them to express their feelings. That is a very important thing. You know, to get after you talk to kids and you need to ask them how they're feeling about these things. Like, for example, today, if they've been watching some things on television or the internet, you ask them about, so what do you think about that? How does that make you feel? Because if they push all these feelings down, then they will turn out later on to be something much more serious in terms of psychological consequences.
So in your book, and again, I just want to give out the title, Lions and Tigers and Terrorists, Oh My, you point out a few different things about how September 11th impacted the mental health of so many Americans, not just kids. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, yes, you know, even though there is so much denial or so much, you know, people don't want to visit the feelings of that day because they were so painful. But it's really important, and people don't realize how we have been affected psychologically ever since 9/11 and to today. You know, we're still being affected in ways like, for example, we know that there's an obesity epidemic, okay? Well, that started after 9/11 when everyone started filling themselves with comfort food, you know, to try to comfort themselves. The increases in drug and alcohol abuse, the increases in suicide, the increases in cutting that teenagers do for the most part. There are so many different negative kinds of things that have come as a consequence of 9/11. So today is not only important to remember in terms of honoring the victims, the first responders, and so on, but it's also important to acknowledge that, yes, we have been affected by these things. And of course, nowadays with coronavirus and the riots and all that, all of these negative kinds of behaviors have been increased, have been exacerbated. And so we need to acknowledge this before we can do anything about it.
So here we are 19 years later, and obviously we've seen the effects that September 11th has had on the generation that was there. You're talking about obesity. I guess what are three practical tips for parents who are in the game today something that they could implement so that they can not only, like you mentioned before, teach their kids about 9/11 in practical teachable moments, but also on what they can do to help their kids deal with this moving forward.
Yes. Well, for today and this next, on the weekend as well, a wonderful thing to do would be to light a candle and in honor of the victims of 9/11, planting a bush or a flowering plant in their memory, having your own moment of silence. You don't have to be, just the moment that there was at the time of the planes crashing and so on. In a more general or long-term sense, it's important to build resilience psychologically and physically. It's important to make yourself as strong as possible, doing things like, I give a whole bunch of different things. I give things that parents can do to build a stronger nest. That's sort of the positive spin on terrorism. If you can use this, because terrorists are not going away. Coronavirus, hopefully the riots will go away eventually. But the terrorists have used this time to recruit more people to join their numbers, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, because people are are locked down and spending their time on the internet and coming across terrorist propaganda, and they're feeling angry and depressed and all of that. And they've been recruiting a lot of people during this time. So it's important to teach kids that, it's not just about 9/11. It's about the fact that we have to make ourselves stronger to withstand and reach our dreams during the ongoing days when there may well be other terror attacks. And so building oneself up, I give kids 10 things to do themselves, to build themselves up. So building themselves up psychologically, as well as physically, as well as being tolerant to other people, teaching people. I talk about radical Islamists. I use the words, radical Islamists, but I also talk about tolerance and xenophobia. And I say xenophobia is a big word, but it means, fear of strangers. And you should look at what's in people's hearts, not just what the color of their skin is, that kind of thing. So you have to balance it, but you can't hide what really is going on in the world.
No, I agree. And with that being said, even when you try to take, a head-on approach to dealing with your children, dealing with mainly, I think it's children, because I think those of us that are of age know from just studying history that this happened. If you weren't alive when it happened, if you're a teenager today, you probably know. But I think it's the younger kids that may be, this weekend, watching the news, seeing these really, really gruesome images of the United States being attacked and being, people. You've seen the footage. You've seen people jumping to their death to get out of these buildings. It's really horrific. So when a child sees that, or someone, I'd say, even pre-adolescent, that may not understand why people hate America as much as they did, or whatever the case was, how do you, what's your advice to a parent that's, trying to deal with children that are potentially getting PTSD from these images?
Well, parents need to look at their children to see symptoms. I call it scared, sad, mad, and bad. And each of those can lead to a more serious psychological problem, but you do have to be sensitive to that. And that's why it's so important to get them to express their feelings, to draw their feelings if they're young, to point to emojis if they're really young or they're not that verbal, but to get out and to let them know this is all okay, and to let them know that there's a lot going on now to protect the United States, and really to teach the lessons of heroism. When you compare the people on Flight 93 or the first responders to some of the things that's going on today, the riots, there's such a disconnect, and we need to train or teach more children why they need to be like these brave people who joined the military or gave their life for America.
Now, if people want to find out more about your practice and the work that you've done in this particular body of work, where can they go?
Well, they can go to my terroristtherapist.com website, terroristtherapist.com, and I do a weekly podcast called The Terrorist Therapist Show, where I talk about the hottest news in terrorism of that week.
All right. Well, there you have it, folks. Terroristtherapist.com. Dr. Carole Lieberman, we thank you for being with us. And of course, she's the author of Lions and Tigers and Terrorists, Oh My. You can check her out at terroristtherapist.com. Dr. Lieberman, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.